For more than 2,200 years, one ancient stone has sat at the center of one of history's greatest breakthroughs, a battered slab that helped reopen a world humanity had lost the ability to read. For generations, scholars believed its mystery had already been solved. They believed they had extracted its meaning, translated its message, and placed it neatly inside the story of ancient Egypt. But what if that confidence was premature? What if, for all this time, we were only reading the surface? The Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, and from the moment it entered the modern imagination, it was treated as the master key to a locked civilization. This was the stone that allowed scholars to begin deciphering the lost language of ancient Egypt. It became famous not because it was beautiful, and not because it was complete, but because it appeared to say the same thing in 3 different scripts. That made it invaluable. Historians eventually concluded that the inscription was straightforward. A royal decree honoring the young king Ptolemy V, written in 3 writing systems so it could be understood across Egypt. Textbooks repeated that explanation for generations. The case, it seemed, was closed. But recently, something unexpected happened. Researchers decided to run the entire inscription through advanced artificial intelligence language models, the same kind of systems now being used to reconstruct damaged manuscripts, identify lost linguistic patterns, and analyze ancient writing beyond the speed and limits of traditional human comparison. Instead of depending only on centuries of scholarly interpretation, the AI examined the inscription at a different level. It looked across patterns, structures, repeated formulas, anomalies in phrasing, and relationships between the different versions of the text that human readers had long treated as minor inconsistencies. What it suggested stunned the people studying it. Because, according to the AI's analysis, the Rosetta Stone may contain more than an official decree. It may preserve layers of meaning that historians either overlooked or explained away. It may contain unusual linguistic structures, subtle textual signals, and possibly even encoded warnings hidden beneath the surface of royal praise. If that analysis holds up, then the Rosetta Stone may not simply be the key that unlocked ancient Egypt. It may be a message that was never meant to be fully understood at first glance. And before we get to what the AI believes it found buried inside the text, there is something important to understand, because the Rosetta Stone has a long history of being misunderstood. In a strange way, confusion has followed this object almost from the moment it entered modern hands. When it was first catalogued after being pulled from the Egyptian town of Rosetta and later handed over to British forces in 1801, it was described in the simplest possible terms: a dark stone bearing 3 inscriptions. That description sounds harmless, but it helped create a misunderstanding that lasted for generations. When the stone arrived in London, the writing on its surface was difficult to see clearly, so white chalk was rubbed into the carved letters to make them stand out. Later, to protect the surface from handling and constant attention, it was coated with carnauba wax. That coating darkened the stone dramatically, giving it the deep black appearance that would become famous. For years, people assumed it was made of black basalt. Then, in 1999, the surface was cleaned, and those old additions were removed. What emerged surprised everyone. The Rosetta Stone was not black at all. Its true surface was dark gray, with a crystalline texture that caught the light differently than people expected. And most striking of all, a faint pink vein appeared across the upper left portion of the stone, a feature that had been hidden for centuries. Geologists compared the rock to Egyptian quarry samples and found that it closely matched granodiorite from a quarry at Gebel Tingar, near Elephantine, on the west bank of the Nile in the Aswan region. The pink vein was not random damage. It was a known characteristic of stone from that area, and it helped settle the question of the monument's true origin. The object itself is physically imposing. The surviving fragment stands about 3 feet 8 inches high, roughly 2 feet 5 inches wide, and a little over 11 inches thick. It weighs around 760 kilograms, or approximately 1,680 pounds. For something that looks so plain in photographs, it has an overwhelming physical presence. But what gives it real power is not its mass. It is the writing. 3 different scripts were carved across its surface. At the top is ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic text, written in a formal and deliberately archaic register known as Middle Egyptian, a style already old-fashioned even at the time, reserved for sacred, ceremonial, and authoritative inscriptions. Beneath that is Demotic, the everyday written form of Egyptian, used during the Ptolemaic period, much closer to the language of ordinary life. At the bottom is Ancient Greek, the administrative language of Egypt under its Greek-speaking rulers. For a long time, that trilingual format made the stone look transparent. It seemed to be saying the same thing 3 times, simply for 3 different audiences. But here is what the AI later flagged as significant. The Rosetta Stone we see today is only a fragment of a much larger monument. The upper hieroglyphic section suffered the worst damage. Only the final 14 lines remain, and even those are broken. The middle demotic section survived in better condition, with 32 lines still legible. The Greek section at the bottom is the most complete, preserving 54 lines, though even that text trails off toward a broken diagonal edge. By comparing the Rosetta Stone to similar decree stelae from the same period, especially the Decree of Canopus from 238 before Christ, scholars concluded that the original monument would have stood nearly a foot taller. That missing section likely included another 14 or 15 lines of hieroglyphs. And above that text, monuments of this kind usually included a carved scene showing the king presented before the gods, often beneath a winged sun disk, the traditional symbol of divine protection and royal authority. None of that survives here. It is gone. The Rosetta Stone reaches us already broken, already incomplete, already missing part of its most sacred frame. Later, the AI would return to that fact again and again, because once you start asking what may be hidden in the surviving text, you cannot ignore the question of what disappeared with the missing top. To understand what the AI believes it found, we first have to understand what the inscription officially says, and just as important, the political world in which it was written, because the official version of the story and the deeper reality behind it may not be the same thing at all. The decree was issued in honor of King Ptolemy V, following his coronation. It was not written as a personal proclamation from the king himself, but by an assembly of priests who met in the ancient city of Memphis. The date was recorded in both Macedonian and Egyptian calendars, placing the gathering on March 27, 196, before Christ, in the 9th year of Ptolemy's reign. The decree names the officiating priests, honors the women of the royal line, and praises the generosity, piety, and legitimacy of the young ruler. But even here, something feels unstable. A second date appears in the text. In the Greek and hieroglyphic versions, another day is given, November 27, 197 before Christ, identified as the official anniversary of the king's coronation. The demotic text then seems to place the decree and the anniversary much closer together. In March, scholars noticed these discrepancies long ago. Most treated them as minor administrative inconsistencies, the kind of thing that happens when calendars overlap and scribes work across languages. Then, they moved on. The AI did not. But before we reach that moment, we need to understand why this decree existed in the first place, because the circumstances around it were anything but stable. In fact, they were desperate. Ptolemy V Epiphanes, son of Ptolemy IV Philopator, became king as a child after both of his parents died, amid court conspiracy and violence involving his father's mistress. After their deaths, power was exercised in the boy's name by figures who quickly lost control. Rebellion spread. Alexandria turned volatile. The people, already enraged, turned against those ruling around the child king. One guardian replaced another. A general named Tlepolemus briefly took control before being removed. He was followed by Aristomenes of Elysia, the chief minister in office when the decree was issued. Egypt's external position was no less dangerous. Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire and Philip V of Macedon had effectively aligned against the Ptolemaic kingdom and began carving away its territories. Philip seized islands and cities in Caria and Thrace. Antiochus delivered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Panium in 198 before Christ and captured Coeli Syria, including Judea. At the same time, Egypt itself was not fully under Egyptian royal control. In the south, a long-running rebellion had taken root during the previous reign and continued to challenge the crown. Rebel leaders such as Horwennefer and later Ankh-Wennefer controlled significant parts of Upper Egypt for years. So this is the world in which the Rosetta Stone was born. Foreign enemies advancing, internal revolt spreading, central power weakened, and a 12-year-old boy being formally crowned pharaoh in Memphis, 7 years after his reign had technically begun. That context changes the feel of the decree completely. Officially, the inscription praises the king's generosity. It says he gave silver and grain to the temples. It credits him with protecting agriculture during an unusually high Nile flood in his 8th year by ordering excess waters managed and restrained. In return, the priests promise loyalty. They agree to honor him alongside the gods, to celebrate his birthday and coronation annually, and to display this decree in every temple in Egypt in all 3 scripts. On the surface, it is a public act of royal celebration. But underneath, it reads like something else, a survival document. A young ruler with fragile legitimacy is effectively purchasing the support of the most powerful priesthood in the land. The priests of Memphis, the highest religious authority in Egypt, are being bound to the throne through honors, gifts, and formal recognition. Historians have always understood that part. What the AI noticed was what sits beneath it. And to grasp why that matters, we have to step back and remember how long the meaning of this stone was completely lost, and how extraordinary it was that anyone ever recovered it at all. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the ability to read hieroglyphs gradually disappeared. Over the centuries, the script had become so specialized that even in its final phase, only a narrow class of priests and scribes could read it fluently. By the 4th century after Christ, very few people in Egypt still understood the old symbols. Then the conditions that sustained that knowledge collapsed. Christianity spread, temples were closed, priestly lineages were broken. The living tradition that connected symbol to sound, word to grammar, and inscription to meaning was severed. The final known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae. Not long afterward, the last known demotic inscription also appeared there. Then the writing systems of ancient Egypt vanished from active use, leaving only silent signs carved into walls, monuments, and stone. To later observers, hieroglyphs looked like pictures, not language. In the 5th century after Christ, a writer known as Horapollo produced a work called Hieroglyphica, describing nearly 200 signs and assigning meanings to them. For centuries, many believed he had preserved real understanding. In truth, much of it was wrong. Instead of solving the puzzle, it deepened the illusion. Arab scholars in the 9th and 10th centuries made serious attempts to interpret hieroglyphs, sometimes by comparing them with Coptic, the liturgical descendant of ancient Egyptian, still used in church contexts. European scholars in the 16th and 17th centuries tried as well. Athanasius Kircher famously called hieroglyphs the riddle of the Sphinx. No one could truly crack them. Then the Rosetta Stone appeared, and everything changed, though not all at once. Progress came slowly. Early scholars recognized that if the Greek text could be compared with the demotic section, royal names might reveal sound values. Swedish diplomat Johann David Åkerblad had already been studying demotic from other sources and suspected it preserved a cursive form of Egyptian related to Coptic. In 1801, French Orientalist Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy received early prints of the stone and quickly recognized that the demotic section matched the script Åkerblad had been working on. Together, they began comparing the demotic and Greek texts, searching for names that had to appear in both. By the following year, de Sacy had identified several names, including Alexandros, Alexandria, Ptolemaios, Arsinoe, and the royal title Epiphanes. Åkerblad published an alphabet of 29 demotic signs, and remarkably, more than half of them proved correct. But then progress stalled. The reason was subtle but fatal. Demotic was not purely alphabetical. It used phonetic signs, yes, but it also contained symbolic and ideographic elements that could not be mapped directly to sounds. That mixture stopped the early decipherment in its tracks. The next major breakthrough came from Thomas Young, Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society in London. In 1814, after corresponding with de Sacy, Young turned his attention to the cartouches, the oval frames enclosing royal names in hieroglyphic inscriptions. Inside one of them, he identified a sequence that matched the sounds of the Greek name Ptolemaios. He also made another crucial observation. Hieroglyphic and demotic were not completely separate systems. They shared many visible similarities, as much as 80 recognizable parallels in some comparisons. That meant demotic was not an entirely different script. It was a transformed descendant of hieroglyphic writing. Young published these findings in 1,819 inches, the Encyclopedia Britannica. It was a major leap, but still not the final one. That final leap came from Jean-François Champollion, a teacher in Grenoble whose obsession with ancient Egypt bordered on the extraordinary. In 1822, he studied copies of inscriptions from the Philae obelisk, where the names Ptolemy and Cleopatra had been identified. By comparing those names across different inscriptions, Champollion isolated phonetic hieroglyphic values with far greater confidence. He realized that phonetic hieroglyphs were not used only for foreign Greek names. They were also used for native Egyptian names. That insight changed everything. On the 14th of September 1822, he presented his findings to the Académie Royale des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres in Paris. In a detailed letter written that same day to the Academy's secretary, he laid out the discovery with astonishing precision. The following year, when he identified the names of Ramesses and Thutmose inside cartouches at Abu Simbel, the system held. At that point, Champollion moved beyond the Rosetta Stone itself and began building a wider grammar of ancient Egyptian, along with a dictionary of hieroglyphic signs. He died in 1832, but by then, his place in history was secure. He had reopened a language silent for roughly 15 centuries. After Champollion, scholars continued refining the Rosetta Stone across all three scripts. German Egyptologists produced revised Latin translations in the 1850s. The first English translation appeared in 1858. Debate continued over which version represented the original form of the decree. Some argued for the Greek, since it fit the administrative context of Ptolemaic rule. Others believed the hieroglyphic version preserved the deeper religious meaning. Others still suggested all three were created together, each shaped for a different audience and tone. But whatever the debates, one thing seemed settled. The stone had been read. The mystery was solved, or so everyone believed, until the AI looked closer. This is where the story turns. When researchers fed the complete inscription into advanced language models trained not only on known vocabulary, but on deep structural patterns found across ancient and modern texts, the system began flagging anomalies that human translators had either passed over or normalized. The first anomaly was the date discrepancy. Human scholars had long noted that the Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic versions do not align perfectly when referring to the same events. The AI did not treat that as scribal sloppiness or calendar confusion. Instead, it identified the discrepancy as a meaningful structural feature, the kind that appears in other texts when a document is designed to operate on two levels at once, one aimed at the official audience, the other carrying a second message for a more selective reader. The second anomaly was subtler, and in some ways more unsettling. When the AI focused on the hieroglyphic section, the oldest sounding, most damaged, and most formally sacred version of the inscription, it detected phrasing constructions that do not appear in ordinary Ptolemaic ceremonial language. These did not look like accidents or clumsy translation choices. They appeared intentional. When those constructions were compared against a database of ancient Egyptian religious, ritual, and prophetic literature, the pattern that emerged was not one of routine royal praise. It more closely resembled warning language, the kind used when a civilization believed itself to be approaching crisis, disorder, or collapse. That changed the emotional temperature of the entire text. Because under that reading, the priests who composed the decree were not simply praising a child king. They may have been embedding something within the formal language of divine authority, something they could not openly say, but also could not bear to leave unsaid. Then came the third finding, and it was perhaps the most disturbing of all. The AI identified numerical and calendrical references, especially in the sections praising Ptolemy for managing the Nile flood and protecting agricultural stability. That seemed excessive for a purely ceremonial decree. When researchers cross-mapped those references with astronomical and historical patterns from the period, they appeared to align with a sequence of natural, political, and celestial events the priests may have been tracking as signs of an ending. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. The Ptolemaic priests assembled in Memphis in 196 before Christ were living through fracture on every side. Foreign powers were pressing inward. Internal rebellion had already broken the kingdom. Royal legitimacy was weak. The cosmic order they were sworn to protect, the order that underpinned Egyptian kingship itself, was visibly unraveling. And according to the AI's analysis, these men may have used the one text they were certain would survive, the one decree they knew would be copied, displayed, and preserved across temples. To leave behind more than a legal religious proclamation, they may have left a warning. Whether that warning referred specifically to the collapse of Ptolemaic Egypt, which did indeed fall to Rome less than 2 centuries later, or whether it pointed to something broader, something they believed stretched beyond their own historical moment, remains uncertain. Researchers are still working through that question. But the AI's larger implication was clear. For 2 centuries, scholars may have been reading the surface of the Rosetta Stone. They found the key, yes. They unlocked the door. But behind that door there may be another chamber altogether, one constructed carefully by the priests of Memphis, hidden not in secrecy, but in plain language arranged with unusual care. For more than 2,200 years, no one found that second layer. It may have taken a machine to notice it. The Rosetta Stone has always been described as a key, a tool, a fortunate relic that allowed modern humanity to recover a lost language. That description is still true. But if the AI is even partly correct, then it was always more than that. The priests who created it may have been thinking far beyond their own moment. They lived in a frightened and fractured Egypt. They watched a child king struggle to hold together a kingdom already coming apart at the edges. And instead of merely engraving praise in stone and sending it into the temples, they may have done something far more deliberate. They may have hidden a message inside a message. Whether that hidden layer is best understood as a warning, a prophecy, a coded record of fear, or something we still do not fully have the framework to interpret, remains an open question. The AI may have pointed toward the door, but walking through it will still require what it has always required: careful scholarship, patience, and the willingness to believe that ancient texts can still surprise us. Because maybe the Rosetta Stone was never just a translation key. Maybe it was always a letter. And maybe we were only ready to read the first page. If you found this as fascinating as we did, make sure to like and subscribe, because the deeper this story goes, the clearer it becomes that ancient history is still holding secrets we may only now be beginning to see.